and there were mobs on the streets. The stores locked their doors. There just were too many people. And of course there were no restrooms available. And so the little ones just had to go on the floor of the car. Had to wet on the floor of the car. Do you want to take that out?
No, it's fine.
Anyhow, let's see. I'm trying to remember.
What kind of celebrations did you do or did you see?
Oh, it just was a lot of noise and a lot of crowds. And everybody was excited. Of course, we still had to beat Japan. And so on VJ Day, it was not quite so... There weren't quite the crowds on VJ Day. It was more sobering that we'd finally won the war and our boys were coming home. And we lost so many. Kenneth lost his best friend. The plane disappeared over the Philippines somewhere and was never heard from. They never found it. They figure it went into the ocean. The Japanese the Zero fighters would just dive into the ships. They'd just go up high and then they'd just point the engine down and turn it on as hard as it would go, and they'd dive right into the ships. And of course, so many of our ships were sunk, but the battleships were able to stand the bombardment. A lot of people lost their lives on the battleships because they were all on the deck and down in the holds working and everything, and there was a lot of life lost. It was a pretty sad thing, and it wasn't anything I'd like to live through again. We had everybody saved foil and all kinds of metal, and they had a big metal dump between our house and the grocery store. And as I'd walk by, I'd look in that metal, and they'd come in periodically and haul it away and make tanks and bullets and whatever they could make out of it, armament. But everybody worked together. There was so much patriotism because we had to win that war. We couldn't let the Nazis take over the world. And we did it.
Absolutely. That's cool. Okay, so victory. Now, do you want to say anything about Roosevelt dying?
Well, everybody remembered it because it was so sad. He was the first and only president to have a third term.
And a fourth. He died partway through his fourth?
No,
third. He had a third term, but I thought he also got elected for a fourth term.
No, I think he only served part of his third term.
Okay, I'm possibly wrong. Yeah.
But Harry Truman stepped right in and took care.
So can you say the whole thing over again? You saying, we remember when Roosevelt died or whatever.
Well, I remember how shocked the whole world was when Roosevelt died, because he was our only three-term president, and he only served part of his third term, I'm sure. And I don't remember too much more about it, except that everybody knew he was crippled, but we never saw him in a wheelchair. We always saw him standing. In the movies, there was always newsreels. When we go to the movies, there was always the cartoons and the newsreel, and then all the ads, and then the movie. But we always had the cartoons and the newsreel, and that's when we saw Roosevelt. I remember the first television I saw was up on a mountain called Mary's Peak, which was the highest point in the Coast Range. And you could vaguely see people through the snow on the television set. It was something just unheard of. Actually saw people walking on that screen.
What year did you guys get your first TV?
Well, we did it to protect the neighbors, because our kids would come home from school and want to go over to the Andersons to watch cartoons. So we finally bought one. Well, Maureen was small. She was probably only 2 or 3 when we got our first television set.
So can you say the whole thing about TVs once more? say we got our first television set?
Oh, we got our first television to protect the neighbors, because when the kids came home from school, they wanted to go over to the neighbors and watch cartoons. And the funny thing was about it, the kids would be playing all over the house when the programs were on. But the minute the commercials came on, they came out from wherever they were and sat down in front of the television set and watched the commercials.
Cool.
And my kids were always happier with a box than they were with their toys. If Kenneth brought home a washing machine box or a big box that the refrigerator came in or something, that was heaven for them.
Okay, so, sure, what did you want to say about 1951?
Well, in 1951, Kenneth got a job, a 5-year job in Forks, and with this man that was coming up here, and they brought all their logging equipment up, and then they came back, and we packed up what we had. Kenneth bought an old truck. We loaded everything we had on a truck, and he and Burl left in the evening about 10 o'clock. And I and the 4 kids at that time started out the next morning, and as we were coming up the hill to Alma, we come up behind this truck with sheets flapping, and it looked like a bunch of rag pickers outfit. And I said to the kids, boy, I sure hope our stuff doesn't look like that. We got up even with the truck, and it was Kenneth and Burl. The sheets that he'd packed around stuff had all come loose, and they were flying in the wind. And we got up here and unloaded the truck and sold it. Sold it for what he paid for it. And we had come up a week or 2 before we moved up to look for a place to live. And there was absolutely nothing to rent in Forks. There was no houses to rent at all. And we finally found the administration building, what they called the Circle Project, which was, there was 3 projects. There was the Circle Project and the wood and the electric project and the wood project. The wood project just had wood heat and wood stoves. The electric had electric stoves. The Circle Project was a little nicer, but the administration building was the only thing that was to rent, and it wasn't built to live in. It was to build a place for people to gather, and it did have a kitchen and a bathroom, and so they let us rent it. We had to come to Port Angeles to find the man that was in charge, and he didn't want to rent it to us, but we just told him, we just can't find any place else to live, and I've got 5 children, and we need a place desperately. Well, you can't do anything to it. You can't put any walls or anything in it. So we moved into it and lived in it. We were there 10 days, and we had to move out because of the fire. And we went out. My husband didn't know where to take us because we didn't know anybody. And so this man he worked with said, well, take him out to my wife, she'll take care of him. And they took us out on the upper Hoe, right in the middle of the forest. And needless to say, I had never seen this woman before in my life, and landed on her with 5 kids. And she took us in. She had nothing but wood and wet wood to cook with, and of course it was in September, the 20th of September, so we didn't need heat. But she took care of us, and we've been friends ever since. But
What was her name?
Kelly Topley. And Chuck came home for a short time the next day, and he said he'd saved hundreds of lives. And oh, Kelly said, how did you do that? And he said, I opened a chicken house door. But the north end of Forks did burn, and a row of tourist cabins. And when we moved there, it was tall trees at the end of Forks, and the next time we saw it, there was nothing but burnt stumps. It was a hot fire. I don't know. The fire turned. There was a Assembly of God church that had a big sign up above it that said Jesus Saves. And the fire turned there and burnt all the houses on the north side of the street and didn't burn anything on the side of the street where the church was. And that was in the Seattle paper. Jesus Saves.
Cool. Okay, so through the 50s, we have Eisenhower and the Korean War.
Well, I was so busy that I don't
You don't remember anything about the Korean War?
remember too much about it. The Vietnam War I remember more about because everybody was so dead set against it, and they were so cruel to the men who came back from the Vietnam War.
Can you start the whole thing over again and saying, because it's better just saying the Vietnam War this or whatever.
I don't remember too much about the Korean War. I remember more about the Vietnam War because so many people were so against it that they were cruel to the men that went over there and fought, and they had no choice. They were drafted and they had to go. And also during the World War II, the draft was... Kenneth tried everything to get into the service. He had one leg was an inch shorter than the other one, and they wouldn't let him in. But he found out he could get into the Merchant Marine, but he would have to pay for his own training, and he wouldn't get any pay for 6 weeks. So that was out because he had a family. So we just, both of us worked in the war effort and did what we could.
So
The day
sorry?
man landed on the moon.
Okay, so before we go there, because we will go there. Do you have anything else to say about the Vietnam War? Like the men coming back, but do you remember anything? Because it was like 8 years or something like that. Wasn't it 8 years long? I can't remember.
I don't remember.
But do you remember like when we evacuated Ho Chi Minh City, or when we first went there, or
I just knew of it.
Yeah, you
I
just knew
just
it.
knew of the things
Okay.
that happened in Ho Chi Minh City and the airlift out of Vietnam when they had to take all of our planes and take as many people as they could on them, and they had to leave a lot of people behind.
Do you recall anybody you knew that went or that was drafted? Anybody that you knew specifically that was drafted, and what happened to them, or how their departure or return affected you?
You know, none of my family were in the right age range.
Mm-hmm. But or friendly friends or anything like that?
I lived in Forks and it wasn't very big.
Yeah, it's okay. It's okay. I'm just trying to find as many connections as I can, you know?
Yeah.
Okay, so before the moon landing or the space program is JFK and his assassination.
Well, Carolyn called me and said, "Mother, have you got the radio on, television on?" And I said, "No, I don't." And she said, "Well, turn it on quick. Our president's been shot." And of course, for 3 days, we did nothing but watch television. We watched everything, all the funeral, the marches, the horses, and everything. It was really something, and just watching that on television, and the horror of it was what it was. It was terrible. He was a very popular young president, and everything was going to be so much better because he was going to turn this country around and get everything going right. And he lived such a short time.
Okay, do you now next we should talk about the space race in general. So you would probably remember like the Gemini flights and the early stuff with like first American in orbit, or the first anything like that, or do you just remember the first moon landing?
I remember mostly the first moon landing because we could watch it on television, and that was something because we watched all the old shows on television. I'll tell you, we watched Oh gosh, don't ask me. Can't think of any right now.
So tell us about the landing on the moon.
Well, the main thing I remember about it was three of my girls were baptized the same day, so there's no doubt that we remember the day they were baptized. And Carolyn had had her eardrum burst when a kid threw a firecracker at her and caught in her hair and blew up and burst her eardrum, and she never was brave enough to let anybody put any water near her head because it was immediate infection if she got water in her ear, because it went right to the inner ear. And when I'd wash her head, she'd always hold her fingers over her ears because she was so afraid of the water. But she trusted Pastor Cross, and he let her put cotton in her ears and let her hold her thumbs over her ears so that she couldn't get any water in them.
Okay.
But it was something to see the men walking on the moon.
Mm-hmm.
It was, and I can't imagine there are people that don't believe that ever happened. There are people who don't believe the Jewish people were massacred during that time, but we knew it. But we couldn't do anything about it.
One of the cool things that I don't know, this is off topic of everything, but I've watched this thing about the war, and they talk about when Eisenhower showed up at the first concentration camp that the Americans found, and he saw what happened. One of his first orders was for people to get video cameras and to videotape it. Mm-hmm. And there's actually a quote of his that's on the wall at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., that talks about how he wanted to document it because he thought that someday people might say this never happened.
I've talked to people who were in that group of men that were over there when they liberated the concentration camps, and there were none of them that could talk about it without tears in their eyes because it was so horrible.
Mm-hmm. It's just crazy. At the Holocaust Museum, have you been there to the Holocaust Museum? It is a hard thing to do. Like, when you go in there, they give you a little passport, and the passport is a picture and a story of someone who was in there. And as you go through it, you can find out whether or not you made it or not. And they pack you, like a whole bunch of people, in this little tiny elevator. They pack you in really tight, so you have a little bit of a feeling what it might have been like to be in a cargo train that traveled here and there, and then they take you like 5 stories up in this building, and then the whole thing is like a big spiral down. And then by the time you're at 4 or 5 floors down, then you exit at the bottom floor. And there's this one room that you go through. This one room must have been 3 stories high, but it was like you went through it at different levels. And then one level is family pictures. Actually, 2 floors